Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again here for our ALCO briefing. Dr. Ed, talk about a black swan that hit us this quarter. I mean, this is kind of ridiculous. I'm glad you're here.
Oh, thanks, Jamie. Hi, everyone. This is the black swan of all black swans. I remember when we last met, we were talking about interest rates and the Dow Jones and what a great economy we had, and it just shows you how quickly things fall apart. It's really nothing like it in anyone's lifetime.
Yeah.
So what's our plan today? We know, Jamie and I understand, that bankers today are much more interested in loan quality than anything else. Asset quality is going to be your burden for months and months and months, and who knows, maybe even years going forward. We're going to try to make some sense of what's happened economically. Jamie and I are going to try, but you have to admit and see how difficult our challenge is, because this is all unfolding. We have one more week left in April. We're sort of in the middle, Jamie, of trying to figure out when things are going to open up, when they're not going to open up. It's a very difficult time. So what we thought we'd do is give you a framework or a template to try to discuss this with your customers, with your colleagues, with your staff, to make some sense of it. And we think that's the best approach. We're going to show you some real numbers of things that actually happen, but I hope you'll take the notion of a template, of an idea to explain what's happening to us very seriously, because I think it helps. Let's start, Jamie.
All right.
We're officially calling it the 2020 recession, even though the National Bureau of Economic Research is the final arbiter, and we're certain that they're going to call this a recession.
Certainly.
April 7th, 2 weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal put out their forecasters poll, and you can see virtually 100% of them said we're going to have a recession. And then here at Seifried and Brew, we developed a threat index on recession. It's extremely accurate. You can see historically when we trace backwards, we predicted the 2001 recession. We predicted the 2007 and 9 recession, and Jamie showed him that corner. This is the current almost 100% probability of a recession.
Yeah, typically when we get above that 70 line, the probability of a recession increases dramatically, and at 80%, it's most likely going to have a recession within the next 12 months. And
so it's
far surpassed
at this point, it's a fait accompli.
Yeah.
Okay. How much GDP we're going to lose? It's interesting. We have some interesting numbers for you, and of course it's all speculation. But the biggest drops we're seeing are the 20 to 30% range. This Friday, or next Friday, May 1st, very interesting day for all of us. Jamie and I follow the PMI index, the Purchasing Managers Index. It's put out by the Institute of Supply Management. The great thing about this index, it comes out one day after the close of the month for that month. How are they able to get the data so quickly? It's a phone survey. Any number below 50% indicates manufacturing is slipping in America. Any number above 50 means it's expanding. We expect the number to be so low, to be almost shocking. I'm predicting in the 30% range. It might even be lower. Jamie, you have any thoughts on it? I mean, we know it's going to be below 50.
It's going to be below 50. It's going to be below the 42% mark.
Yeah.
But when we think about, the shocking numbers, that's all that's been coming out. Shocking numbers. Just the other day with WTI goes negative.
Yeah, right.
By $40. That's crazy.
So let's go through the bad news first, then maybe some good news. Housing starts were released last week. Jamie, we were doing so well, and all of a sudden, a big dip.
Yes.
I have friends in Pennsylvania that are real estate agents. In fact, this happened yesterday. My friend who's a real estate agent called me and said, I got 5 calls this morning of people who want to look at our model home. I had to refuse because we're in a lockdown in Pennsylvania, and some of the realtors are complaining that the states are trying to entrap them. And if you show a home, you can lose your license for up to a year with a hefty fine. So he had to say no to these 5 inquiries, and which really hurt him. it's no surprise that housing starts are down. We expect that trend to continue. U.S. production, as you can imagine, we finally got some data from the Fed. It's for March, and some of March is okay. Early March, we didn't have the lockdown, but most of March, we did have a lockdown. You can see the tremendous drop in production. Then when you break it down by sectors, it's even more shocking. Car and truck production almost evaporated. Furniture production, the yellow, down sharply. All goods, the blue line, again, down sharply. Only food and beverage production is sort of keeping up its pace, and you know why. We all have to eat and we all have to drink. So we expect these numbers to get much worse when they're released for April. That'll come out mid-May. Jamie, we think they're all going to be bad, except maybe for food and beverage. Unemployment, oh my God. The unemployment rate for April will come out the first Friday in May. We expect horror.
Yes.
But Jamie, you want to take them through this? We were at record lows, and then look what happened in March.
Look what happened. We jumped up to that
4.4 from 3.5. We think in April it'll be double digit.
Yes, most certainly. When you could see that, looking at the next slide here, when we look at the number of the job growth this is for March. Remember, we shut down the middle of March.
That's correct.
And already almost 1,700,000 jobs lost.
Yeah.
Now, when we look at the next slide here, and we talk about the initial claims, look where we were. I mean, almost 7 million initial claims when we look on the 28th of March.
Yeah, you're right.
The prior high was 695,000.
Wow, so 10 times worse.
Almost 10 times worse.
So,
and look at this, total for the past 5 weeks, 26 million people have filed, which equates to about 16.2% of the civilian workforce. Since 2010, Dr. Ed, you know how many jobs we created from 2010 to 2020?
Let me think. I think we create around 2 million, 2.5 million jobs a year, so it should be around 25 million total. Yep. Am I close?
About 22.6,
22? Yep.
22.7 million. So we just lost
all the jobs
we created over the past decade.
Yeah, crazy. You know that Seifried and Brewer loves the composite leading index. I mean, it's built into our threat index and recession threat index. It's forecasted every recession since World War II. It's a spectacular indicator put out by the Conference Board, and we just got the March number. Now remember, March wasn't a full lockdown month.
No.
Look what happened to it. It's over to your side, Jamie. Show them.
Here we go. Dropping down below that 105 from where it was above 110.
And for those of you who are listening who aren't familiar with this tool, the blue line is the composite leading index, the one that just dropped so dramatically. The red line is basically the economy. And these gray bars, I hope you can see them on your screen, are our last two recessions. So the economy's doing well, but the blue line's indicating, no, it's not. There's going to be a recession. In the 07 recession, the economy's growing, but this indicator says it's not going to grow for long. There's going to be a recession. And you can see, of course, the blue just fell, almost vertical drop.
Yeah.
So, we didn't tell you anything you didn't know, and we apologize for that. But now I think there's some value in you attending this webinar. Our view is, what can you take from this to use with colleagues, with customers, with relatives, to sort of explain what might happen to our nation? Jamie and I like to talk about the 3 Ds of recession. This is the template we were talking about. The 3 Ds of recession, Jamie, are what's the depth of the recession? This measures the economic loss during a recession or depression.
Yep.
It's usually in the percentage of GDP decline, but you can also use unemployment, and some people use both. The second D is diffusion. Is it just a housing sector? Is it the housing and auto? Is it everyone? So the higher the diffusion number, the worse it is. And of course, the one that you're interested in as a banker is the last one, duration. How many months is this thing going to last? Because the longer it lasts, the longer your assets become non-performing, the bigger the threat to the capital position of the bank and to your livelihood. So remember, depth, diffusion, duration. Using that, how bad is this one going to be, Jamie? Well, we think the depth is going to be seriously bad. You just heard us talk about, we expect the PMI index to be well under 50, well under 42, maybe in the 30s. We think the unemployment rate is going to go double digit. We think the 20 to 30% loss in GDP is possible. We think the diffusion index is going to be very high. Almost everyone is being hit by this, from airlines to travel, to restaurants, the auto industry, housing. The only industries that don't seem to be hit that hard are the food and beverage suppliers. Duration, we see this as very short. Now, we could be wrong on this. This is the one this is 1D we're not really confident in. We think it's going to be short. By that, we mean 6 to 9 months. If we're wrong on it, now we're talking depression, because the first 2 Ds are going to be so bad. If this isn't short, we're going to have a 2020 depression. Now, why do we think it's going to be short? Well, our view is when the virus recedes, and hopefully it's not a super virus that never leaves, but once it recedes, presumably the states will take away the lockdowns and economic activity will begin. Plus, we have already very strong fiscal policies in place, and of course monetary policies in place. The one reason we may not be correct on this is sort of this lingering fear of some consumers that say, I'm still not going out. I'm still not leaving my house. I'm still not going to go to the car dealerships. I'm still not going to the restaurants. That would be problematic.
And in addition, with the diffusion, not only the U.S. economic sectors, but here we're talking about the world.
Yeah, exactly.
So the diffusion, we can add into that almost countries.
Right. Well, we thought you'd like to see the 3 Ds, actual numbers from past recessions and depressions. Here's 3 pretty important U.S. depressions. 1920 to 1921, we had an 18-month depression. We lost 15.7% of our economy. Unemployment got almost to 12%, 95% diffusion. 95% of American industries were hurt. The big one, the real big one everyone talks about, August 1929, March 1933, 43 months of hell. We lost 1/3 of our economy. Almost 1 in 4 unemployment. Unbelievable. 24.9%. 100% of the industries were affected. Later, May 1937 to June 38, we had a shorter depression of 13 months, but a very large drop in GDP, 18.2, 20% unemployment, very high diffusion. Now let's look at recessions. And when you think about the Great Recession, I almost wish we'd have it back. But you can see the 73 to 75 recession lasted a year and a half, roughly. 4.9% of GDP was lost, 9% unemployment, etc. Let's jump down to the late Great Recession, as we call it. Lasted 19 months, 4.3% loss in GDP. We did get a double-digit unemployment rate. This is going to seem mild in comparison. So the 3 Ds, depth, diffusion, duration, a good way to talk about it. But there's one more way to think about recessions, and that's through the famous letters. A V-shaped recession is exactly what the letter V looks like. It comes very quickly, but leaves very quickly. A U-shaped recession is the most common type. It comes relatively quickly, but it lingers. It takes a while to cure, then it goes away. We've had in the past a W-shaped recession, and Jamie, this is beginning to look possible to me, because I'm hearing the virus is going to come back.
Yeah.
So can you imagine a recovery from this, and then the virus hits again, and we have another recession? So this would be the famous double dip. And the L-shaped is the last one. It's the most dreaded. Just like the letter L, a recession comes, but the recovery never comes. It's decades and decades of stagnation. this is what Japan is currently suffering through. I hope we don't see this in America. It would change our life, obviously. What is the most likely kind? Today, I'm still saying V-shaped. Jamie's leaning towards a U-shaped, and he's starting to convince me that maybe he's right. But here's 5 reasons why we think it's going to be short-lived. 1, it's caused by the lockdown. You're not allowed to spend money. You're not allowed to go out. You get arrested or fined if you do. Yeah. But once the coronavirus leaves, presumably the lockdowns will be lifted, and certain states are beginning that process as we speak. There's been $2.5 trillion in stimulus kicked in already, which will help. There's very high congressional discussion, at least at this point, for an infrastructure project. And let's talk a little bit, Jamie, about points 3 and 4. And I think you should stress this with your colleagues. Imagine $1 trillion spent on pizza.
Okay.
Versus $1 trillion spent on highways, bridges, and airports. Which spending, pizza or infrastructure, would lead to higher GDPs in the future? The second one, because you're increasing your capital stock. Yep. The pizzas are eat and gone. Yep. So, to me, if we're going to spend money, I really prefer the infrastructure spending if we can do it. Now, we may have to do the consumer bailout simply because the economy crashed. And God knows we have 0 interest rate, massive quantitative easing, which we'll talk about in a moment. The Fed is supporting the economy like it's never done before. Now, I think it's going to be a V. Jamie thinks it's going to be a U, but you also would think it could be a V. You just recently changed. But when you look at some of the things the Fed has said, different. For example, Charles Evans, president of Chicago Fed, said early April, historically, people in the Fed wouldn't mention recession until it was absolutely officially determined. They didn't want to jinx it. They just weren't allowed to use the word recession until it was here. Well, now they're all talking about it. This is John Williams, New York Fed. I don't see the economy being back to full strength by the end of the year. Oh boy. So that's at least 9 months recession. Yeah. It's going to take longer. What, a year, 2 years? Even as restrictions are relaxed, people may take quite a while before they're willing to get back on airplanes, on trains, or go to the theater, or go to concerts, or things like that. Philip Harker, he's the president of our Philly Fed right here. I don't expect to snap back quickly. I'm not a fan of the V-shaped recovery. The goal is to make a U-shape, but a very narrow U-shaped. Maybe, Jamie, I think that's probably where you are now, and I'm moving there. But this is our favorite quote. Jamie, you want to go through this? This is James Bullard.
Yeah,
he has a great sense of humor. Go ahead.
This is a great quote. The second quarter data will be so bad as to warrant being omitted from the normal process. It will not be comparable to anything we've seen in the U.S. macroeconomic history. We should just sort of write it off, right? The second quarter and quit comparing it to other periods. So in other words, why even report it?
Yeah.
Forget it even happened. Let's move on.
Well, I'm thinking about your banks, and I'm thinking about safety and soundness exams. Mm-hmm. And I'm praying that the regulators at all levels, state and federal, do not grade us on absolute numbers, but grade us against our peers. Yeah. So if in the past a 2% non-performing asset would get you a very poor CAMEL rating, but if everybody has 2%, I hope it's a normal CAMEL rating. So we'll see how that goes out. So having said this, it doesn't take away your problems back at the bank.
That's right.
It makes our life a little bit easier, but not yours. How to end the recession, rapid fiscal and monetary policy response. We got $2 trillion in checks already. It looks like by the end of the day we have another half a trillion.
Yep.
And here's a good way to think about it. When I was struggling with macroeconomics in grad school, I had a professor who simplified it for me, and from that day forward, I sort of understand it. So think of the GDP as a big plastic bucket, a pail,
Okay.
that's suspended from the ceiling. And the GDP is liquid. So if you prick a hole on the bottom, it starts leaking out. That would be the lockdown. That would be the reduction in spending. We think it could be 20% of GDP. The GDP is roughly 21 trillion, so 20% would be $4 trillion. So think of a leakage of $4 trillion from the bucket. Well, we're just putting two and a half back in. Does that make sense? So in other words, as the GDP leaks out, the government is filling the bucket back up, at least trying to get it filled back up as best they can. This happened recently. The Senate passed the bill, the $480 billion bill. It's in the House this week. We expect it to be passed pretty quickly.
Yes.
Jerome Powell gave a speech in Washington April 9th. We will continue to use our powers forcefully, proactively, and aggressively.
Wow. That's forcefully, proactively, and aggressively. And they have.
And they have. Until we are confident we are solidly on the road to recovery. Mm-hmm. It's our view that what he can do is helpful, but not nearly as helpful as filling back up the bucket.
Yeah.
Which is fiscal policy, spending. So what did the Fed do? Well, on March 15th, they took rates to zero, and they announced a $700 billion QE spending program, which has the impact of lowering long-term rates. And the March 23rd meeting, part one, they said, guess what? Our QE is unlimited. We said it was $700 billion, it could be more. And immediately, they began to purchase $375 billion in treasuries and $250 billion in mortgage securities to support our economy. They announced that they would start buying commercial mortgage-backed securities, which should help the apartment debt issue. They also launched 3 new lending facilities. Jamie, you want to go through these?
Yeah, overall, they did the term asset-backed securities. They did this again. They did this back in 2008,
Yep.
2007. So they're going to lend money to investors to buy securities back with credit card loans and other consumer debt. That's good. They're going to lend to investment-grade companies, something they have not done before, to provide that bridge financing. And now, the biggest thing, they're going to purchase corporate bonds issued by highly rated companies. And in fact, they went so far as to say, even if these bonds have become junk bonds today, they're still going to buy them as long as they were highly rated prior to the COVID.
Remember,
impact.
before that, it was only treasuries and mortgage backs,
Yeah,
guaranteed by some agency. So this is a real,
The next step, will they get into the equities?
where they buy equities. Well, the stock market's been improving, so probably not, at least at this point. Let's look at GDP more closely. And Jamie's really taking this to a new level, in my view. So how far the GDP falls will impact your non-performing loans. The greater the fall, the greater problems you're going to have.
Yep.
The greater the drop in GDP, the more your bonds are going to lose in their value. So we have bonds trading 91 cents on the dollar, 70 cents on the dollar. If the GDP drop is immense, number will go down. So, Jamie, take us through our GDP equation and tell us what these percentages mean.
Okay, so overall, when we look at GDP, as you recall, we have these 4 components: the consumer component, the investment component, and then we have the government, and then the net export. So the percentages are the percentage of overall GDP. So the $21 trillion, 68% comes from the consumer. Huge number.
14 trillion, yep.
Okay? 17% comes from the investment portion. So these are the fixed investment from businesses as well as residential fixed investment. 18% comes from the government.
That's federal, state, and local.
Federal, state, and local, exactly. And then usually the net exports comes out as a detraction of about 3%.
Because we import more than we export.
Exactly. So when we look at the overall components of that C, that consumer, the 68%, Look at where we were back in the fourth quarter 2000.
We don't have the first quarter data yet. That's coming out next week.
Next week,
right?
But motor vehicles,
$500 billion. That's what's at stake, $500
Yes.
billion. So if car sales vanish, we lose $500 billion.
that's right. Food and beverage, this is for consuming on premises, is $1 trillion. Clothing and footwear, 400 billion. Gasoline, 300.
That number's going to go down for sure because
Yes.
the price is down and people aren't driving.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think over the past 4 weeks, I filled up my tank once.
Yeah, exactly.
And then healthcare, which is a big number at 2.5 trillion. However, recall that right now, all non-essential surgeries are not being done, and that is the bread and butter
Yeah.
of the healthcare industry.
This next slide, we're worried that you may not be able to see the numbers, so we're going to help you with it.
Yeah.
I hope you can see this is last year, $21.4 trillion GDP, 14.5 of it was from consumption. This is what's at risk.
Yeah.
But Jamie did a nice breakdown of the consumption on a per daily basis.
Yeah,
So what's
per
at
day,
stake?
it's about $40.5 billion per day.
So every day, we spend about $40 billion on average. Now, obviously, the holidays are more than, we spend $40 billion on average per day as a nation.
Yes. So if we look at a 50% reduction of that, so over this time period per day, we reduce that by 50, so you get $20 billion per day. If we're shut down for 30 days, that's over $500 billion, $608 billion, or 2.8% of total GDP.
There you have it.
So that's subtracting it out. So that would look, we look at the percent of GDP and the different reductions. If we were at 60%, that's 3%. Now we're down below in the negative territory for the first quarter of
Right.
2000.
So let's use 3% as an average for production, for consumption. So if we're locked down for 5 months, that's 15% of GDP.
Yeah.
And that's just
consumer.
That's just consumers. There's everything else.
The
Right.
business segment is also going to be hit.
Exactly. Okay. Jamie, I'm going to let you take over here. This is your bailiwick with respect to rates. You have some interesting slides for our folks.
So when you look at the rates, I mean, it is amazing to me to look at some of these rates and how far we fell in such a short amount of time. Just this year, the 10-year Treasury started out at 1.92, and we're down to 0.63. So we're off 130 basis points.
Wow.
130 basis points. That is tremendous. However, the good news here, the spread between the 10-year and 2-year is actually up to 41 basis points. So that's positive.
Yeah, because remember, when it's negative, that's a recession sign. In fact, it's almost hard to believe it's positive.
Yeah. So
That the yield curve is not inverted.
yeah, so on the 9th of March, we saw the 10-year Treasury hit its low at 54%, or 0.54%. So we've been down to the 30s already in an interday, but at day end, we were at 54. So now we're up a little bit to 0.63. Now the question is obviously, how will a sustained low yield curve impact net interest margin? 80 to 90% of a bank's revenue is based off of net interest income. This is an important thing that we need to look at. So overall, just a little history on net interest margin. At the end of the year, for the fourth quarter, we were at 3.2% for the U.S. commercial banks. You look back in history, we're not doing too bad. During 2009, we increased there above 3.5. So we weren't doing too bad. Now the question is, how is this going to be impacted by this 10-year Treasury of sub 1%? Yield and earning assets is one of the components of net interest margin. At the end of the year, we're at 4.06%. Now, this tends to follow the 10-year Treasury. So if we map out the 10-year Treasury along with the yield and earning assets, we could see, just by looking at it, there is some correlation. And it's lagged a little bit. So when we stick this into some models, we'll look at linear regression and a second order polynomial. So we look at these two. This is just giving you a calculation to figure out what the next yielding earning assets could be based off of the 10-year Treasury. So if we say the 10-year Treasury averages around 0.7%.
By year end.
Yeah, by year end. When we look at the linear regression, that would suggest, if you put into the calculation, that yielding earning assets would be about 2.07. Now remember, we were at 406. That's 200 basis points. Extraordinary. Likely, probably not.
No.
All right. But that's why we use multiple models here. We look at the second order polynomial, more reasonable, 3.84. I think this is a little aggressive. I don't think it's going to be that high. It'll be somewhere between the two. So if we average them out, you look at about 3% or 2.95%. So that's component one. Let's look at component two, the cost of funds. This is where we were at the end of the year at 83 basis points. Now, look at where we were back before the Great Recession. Could you?
Yeah.
Above 3%. That's amazing. We dropped down below 50 basis points before we started inching up. So we look at this, and we look at it compared to the effective Fed funds rate. And fairly strong correlation here, and we know that oftentimes banks will benchmark it, or at least use it as a proxy for what they're going to do with rates. The issue is that we're at 83 basis points. Previously, we were at over 300 basis points. We don't have far to fall. We look at the same linear regression in a second order polynomial, and this would suggest with an effective federal funds rate at 25 basis points, which we're going to be here for not quarters,
years.
I think years.
Yeah.
We're going to be here for years. Linear regression will give us 47 basis points. The second order polynomial, 50 basis points, you average them. We're at 49.
0.5 cost of funds. So we're going to see a substantial 30 basis point drop in cost of funds by year end.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when we look at this, overall, we were at, like we said before, 3.2 for net interest margin at the end of the year. The average of the linear regression and the second order polynomial, 2.44. That's scary. I think it'd be closer to this number, not quite that. I think it's going to be closer to 3%. But overall, if things work out, 2.44. And this is just put this down here as a matrix. You can pause and look at this. But overall, this just shows what the net interest margin would be based off of the different yielding earning assets and cost of funds.
So those banks who have a lot of demand deposits with very low interest rates versus a bank with a lot of CDs, you're going to have relatively high net interest margins.
Yep.
Versus those who don't.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I was thinking, Dr. Ed, this is pretty low, the 2.44 for a net interest margin. Across history, have we ever reached this?
I saw this slide before. You're going to be shocked when you see this.
All right. So when we look at the net interest margin across history, going back
To the 30s.
to the 30s, we don't have data past the 30s, right? So this line here, this shaded area represents that spread between the linear regression and polynomial.
And the blue's the actual.
And the blue is the actual.
So
we could.
when you hear Jamie saying we're going to have a net cost of funds of 2%, it's happened. It happens in the Depression years.
Yeah.
Below 3, it's happened a lot.
It has.
Now there's an offsetting factor, Jamie, and this topic I think will be discussed at board levels for decades. But let's talk efficiency ratio. Let's talk, some of you are probably listening to this at home, you're not at work. What's going to happen, Jamie, to bank efficiency ratios if we find out we can offer the same services to our customers with 90% of our management staff staying at home? do we need an 8-story corporate office? Or suppose our deposits and branch function work with lower staff. And instead of having 100 tellers, can we keep the same deposit level and the same level of customer satisfaction because customers are getting used to online banking and telephone banking and drive-up services? Can we knock out 50 tellers? So I don't think it's going to go higher.
No.
I think our operating costs are going to go lower once this all shakes out. I think the original reaction is going to be, wow, look, we met our branch, our total deposits are the same, and we only had half the staff working. Why do we need the full staff? So this is going to happen. It's going to take a long time. Jamie's son, a college student, is home, taking classes at home, and his school president said, we may not come back for the first fall term either. So what's it going to mean for education? Do we need the brick and mortar schools? If we find out students pass competency tests at the same level they did while attending brick and mortar, why do we need brick and mortar? I mean, it's going to be a revolution in terms of thinking.
Especially for those majors that don't require like labs.
Right.
Like chemistry or biology labs or meteorology labs. For those topics, you need to be physically there. But for business and other topics, you don't need to have a physical location. So I think it's going to be, the longer we stay here, the more of an impact long-term and the change of the philosophy people are going to have on education and working at home. It's essential.
And if you don't mind, I want to give you a personal note from Dr. Ed. I've been studying the deaths this virus has caused by state. And I found something out yesterday that was very interesting to me. I'm not sure if you know the geography of the Northeast, but take the state of New York. There are 5 states contiguous to New York. And it's surprising what they are if you don't live in the Northeast. Even if you live in the Northeast, you might be surprised at what 5 states border New York. Well, obviously, New Jersey borders New York. Pennsylvania borders New York. Connecticut borders New York. But so does Massachusetts, and so does Vermont. This is way up north. New York goes all the way up to the Canadian border. So if you take New York state deaths and add the 5 contiguous states to that total, and divide by the total death, guess what percent of the U.S. deaths from the coronavirus are from New York and its 5 contiguous states? 2/3. So in my view, we don't have a national pandemic. We have a New York State pandemic. 2/3 of all the deaths are right here in this very small geographic region.
England.
Yeah. So we could talk forever, couldn't we, about lockdowns and whether or not we should have done it and who's to blame and what's going to happen to China. Oh my God, that's a topic for another debate.
Yes.
This is our last slide, isn't it, Jamie?
Yes, sir.
Well, I hope we've given you some comfort. I hope we've given you something to talk about. We wish we had a better forecasting tool for you. We're as up in the air as you are. It's going to depend, of course, on the lockdown, when those are removed. It's going to depend upon the consumer's reaction. Are they ready to go outside again? I mean, we see it, and I see it with neighbors. They just haven't left the house. So thank you, and we'll hopefully see you in 3 months.
Yes. Thank you, Doctor, for coming in.
Thanks, Jamie.
Have a great day.
Thanks.